Well, hey again, Life Group Leaders. We are so excited for this week, and we want to welcome you to your Life Group Leader training video. This week, our passage is Matthew chapter 4. Matthew chapter 4 is what we're going to be looking at, and specifically verses 1 through 11. And so we're going to see the temptation of Jesus in that story. So if you haven't had the time to read through Matthew chapter 4, and even in particular those first 11 verses, I encourage you, go ahead and stop this video, go spend some time with that passage and with the Lord, and then you can return to this video and get ready to lead your group. But Matthew's gospel is constantly alluding to and quoting the Old Testament, more so than any of the other gospels. While the other gospel writers do this, Matthew, more so than any of the other gospel writers, creates an Old Testament backdrop for the story of Jesus. He tells the story of Jesus through the lens of the Old Testament. And his purpose in doing this is to show his audience that Jesus is the fulfillment of all that the Old Testament hopes for and all that it points to, that Jesus is that long-awaited Messiah, that he is what the Old Testament is pointing towards. And so he does this through clever ways, through allusions, through quotations, and more so than any of the other chapters of his gospel, Matthew chapter 4 and the temptation of Jesus is a clear allusion to Old Testament stories that his audience would have been familiar with. And so he does this in several different ways. The first thing that he does is there's obviously Old Testament quotations all throughout the temptation narrative. Jesus quotes scripture himself. Satan quotes scripture himself. There are tons of Old Testament quotations. Another way that he does this is through allusions. We're told that Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness, and the Israelites, we know, were led by God by a pillar of fire and a cloud throughout their time, their wanderings in the wilderness and at Sinai, and all of these times they were led by God, led by the Spirit, just as Jesus is. We're also told that Jesus fasted for 40 days, and 40 days is a clear reference. This number 40 is all throughout the Old Testament. We're told that the Israelites wander in the wilderness for 40 years. Moses is with the Lord on Mount Sinai for 40 days and 40 nights. Over and over and over again, this 40 number is used, and Matthew uses it here to show us what Jesus is doing. We see another allusion here to the Old Testament, and it's a more distant one, but if you pay close attention, you see it. Because Matthew shows us that Satan tempts Jesus just the way he tempts Adam and Eve. Because Adam and Eve, they are tempted by Satan in that Satan takes the truth and he twists it. He takes the truth and he twists it. Satan says to Adam and Eve, "Did God really say that you can't eat from any tree in the garden?" That wasn't true. God had put limits on what they were supposed to do, but what they were supposed to do was not eat from one tree in the garden. Satan also says to Adam and Eve, if you do this, you will be like God. If you eat from this tree, you will be like God. And we know that Adam and Eve were already like God. Satan does the same thing with Jesus. He takes the truth of Scripture and he twists it. He gives Jesus a promise that is already true. He tells Jesus that if he bows down before him, that he'll make them the ruler of all of the nations. Jesus is already the ruler of all the nations. And so Satan acts the same way with Jesus that he did with Adam and Eve. And so over and over and over again, Matthew paints this backdrop of the Old Testament, in particular, paints a backdrop of Old Testament failures, of people failing tests, people failing to be human. And Matthew shows us that where all of the characters in the Old Testament failed, Jesus overcomes. Jesus succeeds. Jesus passes the test that no one can pass. In the temptation of Jesus, we see that Jesus shows us what we are meant to be, that he shows us what it looks like to be human. And so this week, we want you to show your group that truth through this passage, that Jesus shows us what it looks like to truly be human. And we also want you to challenge them. We want you to challenge them to think through times where, like the Israelites and like Moses, that they've failed, that they've been tempted and they've failed. We want you to think about those times and think about how Jesus acts differently. I want you to challenge them with that. And so this week, we want you to challenge them to find 3 passages of Scripture that they can turn to, like Jesus does, when they're tempted. 3 passages of Scripture that they can cling to when they're tempted. And so challenge them with that and encourage them with the truth of the temptation of Jesus, that He is what we were meant to be. Well, that's our main idea. That's our challenge for the week. We hope you have a great week, and we will see you soon.